So we're going to change gears again. We're going to go to Kirk Borne, and Kirk's going to talk. What's that? Yeah, there's some gears in this thing too. Yes. So Kirk's going to talk a little bit about some of the citizen science that Eyal talked about just at the end of his talk. And Kirk's at George Mason University and also is a contributor to our book project.
Great. Thank you, Mike. So as I say, now for something completely different. I think there's just exactly one equation in this talk, and just so you don't miss it when it goes by, it's the fundamental equation for galaxy mergers, which you'll see later on. So anyway, so the topic today is derives from the big data flood in science, which we know about from the sort of emergence of informatics research. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how that leads into involving citizen scientists, that is non-professional scientists. Okay, so these are people who are not trained at PhD in science, but they can help science deal with this data flood by just applying sort of their just human natural abilities, cognitive abilities, and interpreting and looking at information and data for us. So I'll be talking about that human computation, examples of citizen science, and then specifically this new universe framework, which is evolving out of this, and some machine learning data mining challenges coming out of that project. So this is, of course, the problem we're facing, which is this humongous data flood the scientists are coping with. And we already saw a slide like this in Mike's earlier presentation this morning about this sort of emerging fourth paradigm of science, which some people call data science, data exploration, data mining, data-intensive science, or X informatics. So there's a lot of different names. So X informatics, where X is anything like bioinformatics, climate informatics, eco-informatics, astro-informatics, these kinds of things. And so I really would love to give them that talk, but I really want to talk about one aspect of informatics, and so you can't read all of this, but I found this actually quite interesting. This was online. I'm an astronomer, so I don't generally look at grant solicitations anywhere beyond NSF and NASA, but here's one from the NIH website where they call for proposals in the informatics area, and there's a whole bunch of different things listed here of what they consider informatics research, from data mining, visualization, high-performance computing, knowledge representation, ontologies, just a wide variety of things. And two of them on this list caught my attention. And that is, there's this one down here called human-machine interaction, so a study of how humans interact with data or contribute to the understanding of science disciplines. And also the last one, which probably shouldn't have been last on the list, but it's more about sort of the education, science education ideas of using information. It says information technology, but I like to say using information data to enhance learning, retention, and understanding of science disciplines. Okay, so this is really an important thing for us. And so I asked myself, and we always ask ourselves, what do we do with all this information and data? And I think we understand that the data volumes are so much that old technologies and old techniques just might run us over. So how will we respond to this? We need something better. And as my namesake would say, Kirk, we need something better. I don't know what egos has to do with it, but anyway, so we need computers. Of course, no. We need computers, but not the usual kind, the classical kind of computers, which were human beings who crunched data. So I tell my students back in the early 20th century, the Harvard College Observatory had computers, okay, and we're talking like in the 19-teens, and even before the 19-teens, and these people were actually paid to actually look at the Harvard image sky survey with the Harvard Sky Patrol images and measure brightnesses of stars and that kind of thing. Okay, so these computers were basically what we call now data analysts or data assistants, research assistants. Okay, so frequently you would see an ad in the Harvard College student newspaper for job openings for computers, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so we're talking about human computers. And so that leads to this sort of concept of human computation, which is at the bottom of this list. So these sort of three modes of computing which we're familiar with. There's numerical computation, which is all wonderful, great, big, huge computers, supercomputers running simulations for us, but these are extremely model dependent. Okay? They're fast and efficient, but they're only as good as the inputs, the hypotheses, the parameterizations of your model. Okay? So yeah, we do these wonderful simulations of the entire universe, but the parameterized, for example, we heard earlier this morning that the lambda CDM has 6 free parameters. So we're parameterizing all of the physics we know about, and so they are very subjective in that sense, even though they're very good and powerful. So with the advent of huge data, science is moving into this dimension, as I said before, where we have computational intelligence, where it's data-driven, evidence-based, looking at patterns and trends in the data. Okay, so these sort of basically data mining algorithms are objective in that sense, is that the data, the evidence tells you what's there. Okay, so you're not presupposing a pattern, you're searching for the pattern. All right, but this human computation down here, so we have silicon-based computing there, and when we get down to carbon-based computing down here, this is also data-driven and objective. That is, the human sees and explains what they see. Okay, so it's based upon the power of the human cognition, but it's completely objective, hopefully. Okay, we remove subjectivity from people looking at data. The great thing about this is people can see patterns. Okay, they can see anomalies, outliers, a lot more so than maybe a computer. And so the example that Al, is that right? Gave this morning about the galaxy zoo, and you'll see galaxy zoo later, is that if you have a spiral galaxy, is the spiral clockwise or counterclockwise? Okay, it's really kind of hard to train a computer to find that out, especially if there's tilt in the galaxy, for example, and there's all kinds of dust lanes and other obscuration in the image. It's really, really hard to train image processing software to find that out, but a human can look at it really quickly and see it. And that's just an example of the kind of thing that humans are really good at. So they're excellent at finding patterns in image classification, able at finding these anomalies. But the problem is with humans is that they're pretty slow compared to silicon-based computing, certainly low bandwidth and easily distracted. Okay, so there's lots of problems there. So what do? Well, you don't do one or two, so the sort of the two-ish problem, you do the biggest problem, and that is you enlist hundreds of thousands of these people. Okay, so I'll talk about how we got there. But first a little side story on human computation. And I actually heard a talk by Luis Baran on this topic. I don't know if you're familiar with Luis, but he's one of the MacArthur fellows and recipient of numerous awards. Fairly young guy. I mean, when I first saw the first talk he gave on this topic, he couldn't have been much beyond his mid-20s, but he had numerous awards by then. And he invented this concept of human computation, which is computation that's impossible by computers alone. Okay, so you're all familiar with this type of thing, which is called a CAPTCHA, right? So when you set up an account on Yahoo or Mail, or you try to post something on a blog site or something, it says, okay, type the words you see, right? And so the idea is that when there's a word like this that's all distorted, has lines running through it, your human eye can easily pick out what the word is, but it's very, very hard to train character recognition software to know what this word is. Okay, because it's got lines running through it. I mean, it's just, your image segmentation software just can't handle that word. So here's a problem which requires a human. So it's essentially impossible for a computer, but there's also another case, which is where you have so much data that you need some additional help getting just beyond your normal algorithms that crunch on. So what's another word for this? Image annotation, I would call it. Basically, the human can look at the image and then say something about it. That's what I would call image annotation. So when I heard Luis give this talk, it must have been like 2005, about 6 years ago. I thought to myself, it's sort of the light bulb moment. Okay, so I had the aha experience that this is exactly what we need for astronomy. And I started talking with my friends about this concept of an annotation service for astronomy, how we present images to people and they annotate it. Well, imagine my shock a couple of years later when Galaxy Zoo came out and took the world by storm, and they had done the very thing, which several of us were thinking of after Luis's talk. Anyway, so the example he gave in his talk was the ESP game, which is just very simply shown here, where it's basically an image labeling program. So in order to improve the Google image search and the Yahoo image search tools, you need better keywords describing the image besides just the name on the file, for example. Okay, so have people look at the images, user 1 and user 2, who are unknown to each other, they're somewhere in the world, and they type words, and when the words match, they get points. Okay, so giving them points is good for the user. It's also good because those words probably didn't come at random to match. They really do describe something in the image. Okay, so there was a very interesting idea of actually using people, okay, sort of slave labor, but anyway, no, using people to solve problems which are essentially very hard by computers. So for example, this is a picture of a room. It's in a house, it has plants, it's a corridor, it has columns. I mean, imagine trying to extract all that information from some image segmentation software, probably pretty close to impossible. So it takes a human to interpret a complex image. So I usually give this image to my students to try to explain the process of science. So the scientific method, which starts with characterization of what you see, right? So no interpretation, no model, no hypothesis, just characterize, describe what you see. And so I have half the students face the front of the room and half with their back to the screen, so they can't see what's there, and have the rest of the students try to describe the image without actually saying what's in the image, and see if anybody can guess it. And after a little while, they sort of come around close to it, but they never actually quite get the contrail thing there, but they sort of get the concept of an airplane and the moon image. But so it takes a human to interpret a complex image, usually. So if you can't read the punchline, it says, it's black and it looks like a hole, so I say it's a black hole. Anyway, so citizen science emerged out of this idea of human computation, where anybody can participate in the science discovery process. Anybody with awesome teaching. Anyway, so citizen science. Okay, this is different from science at home. So sometimes there's this confusion. I say, oh, SETI at home, I know all about citizen science. Well, that's an example of, but not really in the formal definition of citizen science, and believe me, there is a formal definition, because this is actually getting very significant amount of attention in the education community, specifically informal education, but now it's being incorporated in formal science education as well. So you're probably familiar with things like SETI at home and LSC at home, climateprediction.net, floating at home, Einstein at home, these kinds of things. So these are what I would call passive, okay? It's screensaver software, basically. Okay, so your machine wakes up and does this when you go to sleep, so to speak. So when you walk away from your computer, you go take a coffee break, you come to a seminar, hear someone talk, the BOINC, the Berkeley Open Infrastructure for Network Computing, that wakes up and starts analyzing data. That's great. I mean, this is a very important way of dealing with the data flood, but it's passive in that sense, other than you download the software, then it's on its own. Citizen science actually is very active, exploits the cognitive ability of humans, that is people looking at the data, looking at information. In most cases now it's images, but it can be beyond images, but for example, just like correlation plots, have people look for trends in time series or whatever, but images is certainly very simple for people to look at and describe what they see. So citizen science goes by different names depending upon who you talk to, like in NASA they call it participatory science, and then the geo community they have this thing called volunteer geographic information, so volunteer science, and Galaxy Zoo is sort of the prime example of this. And I can tell you plenty of stories over lunch about Galaxy Zoo, which I don't have time for right now. Since I'm standing between you and lunch, I understand that. Okay. So citizen science, as I said, refers to the involvement of volunteer non-professionals in the research enterprise. And the people who are very serious about this do come up with a formal definition. Okay, so it has to satisfy these these rules for it to be called or to be real citizen science. It must be engaging, must work with real scientific data, and I put all of it in quotes, that is to say, just not some little select piece of it. You allow people actually to participate in the same process that scientists are involved with. It must not be busy work. Okay, so it's not just clicking for fun. So you can create games to do this, that's fine, but it's not citizen science, it's a game. Okay, and all clicks must count. That is, whenever people contribute, that everything they contribute is added to the pool of knowledge that you use to analyze. Now, I will give you one Galaxy Zoo story in this, and that is there's some people who try to game the system. So what Galaxy Zoo is, again, people look at these images of galaxies, and they click some buttons on the screen that describe what they see. Okay, so that's a really short answer. Description. Some people just try to game the system. They just click buttons to do as many galaxies as they can. Okay, so somehow they think they're gaming the system. I'm going to get 1 million galaxies, 10 million galaxies. I'm going to get high up the leaderboard. Well, there is no leaderboard. Okay. So what's actually happening is they think they're gaming us, but we're gaming them, because we're collecting all those statistics to determine what is the likelihood that there's a person out there who's gaming the system. And so the more of those we see, the more we can compute a very high probability of how many people do that, and what's the likelihood distribution of a particular classification or characterization being correct, or that kind of thing. So every click must count. So even those clicks go into the weighted mean of like a galaxy class. The weight might be 10 to the minus 40, but it goes into the equation anyway. must count. I put in bold here that the experience must address authentic science research questions. And again, these are beyond the capacity of the science teams. That goes back to this concept of human computation, problems that are not solvable by your standard means. When we have a huge data flood, this is an example. And it must involve the scientists, the final step. That is, it's not just a game you put online, you walk away. The scientists are actually busy involved with it. So we'll tell another little story about that. I don't want to tell too many galaxies or stories, so there's tons of them. But it actually started because a graduate student was asked at Oxford University to go and look at all galaxies in the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, which you heard about this morning, that have redshifts. Okay, so 1 million of the galaxies in the Sloan Sky Survey have redshifts. Look at each of them and classify. Well, he did like 50,000, and he gave up and swore he would never do it for the rest of his life. After a month, the guy was going blind. He said, this is absolutely crazy. So he set up a little, in the process of doing the 50,000 that he did, which is, okay, that's only 5% of the million that he wanted to do. And at that point, he threw up his arms. But during that month, he set up a little script that basically grabbed an image from the archive, displayed it, and put some buttons on the screen where he could just choose the button. And hence was born the Galaxy Zoo interface. Okay? It was basically a tool that the scientist was using to do the problem, but the problem was beyond the capacity of a scientist, because again, even though it's a scientist doing it, the attention span is just so limited, right? After doing 50,000 of anything as a scientist, I think you're going to get pretty tired and frustrated. Anyway, so I mentioned Galaxy Zoo as a main example, but it actually goes back even farther. So American Association of Variable Star Observers, which are amateur astronomers, okay, not professionals, again, they're engineers, lawyers, whatever. These people have been measuring the brightness of variable stars in the sky since the 1800s. Okay, so this is over almost nearly 2 centuries worth. The Audubon bird counts go back, I don't know how far back, to the early 1900s or prior to that even. Okay, so over 100 years. And there's just various other projects which are now the online projects. Galaxy Zoo, as I mentioned, has been very successful. There's about 20 scientific peer-reviewed publications. Okay, these are refereed papers in major astronomy journals. Okay, the Astrophysical Journal, the monthly notices. These things which are the primo journals in astronomy. And what I will talk about is sort of this new framework we're developing, which is the Zooniverse, which is a buffet of zoos. And this all comes under a context of something that I coined called U-Science, where you get sort of user-centric science. And it's not just citizen science, but it's also scientists doing annotations. And there's examples of this already in existence. In the biology world, the Bio-Distributed Annotation System, BioDAS, Wikiproteins, the Heliophysics knowledge base. These are things where scientists are doing something similar, but annotating their data in a public way that anyone can share the knowledge that's generated. So anybody can participate and contribute to the science. I'm sure you've seen this cartoon from the early days of the internet, where it says on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. So your dog can contribute, your cat can contribute. So Galaxy Zoo basically presented this simple interface to ask people to click some simple buttons, and it was very addictive. It was amazingly addictive. And again, because this guy, Alfred Smith, when he created this thing, he wanted it simple. Bring up an image, click a button, bring up an image, click a button, bring up an image, click a button. It was just like, and people got used to this. Wow, another one, just another one, okay, just another one, okay, just another one. Okay. So before you know it, we had several 100,000 users. It's now about 400,000 worldwide. We have 1 million galaxies and over 200 clicks, 200 classifications per galaxy. I don't know, the most recent number might be 250 million classifications total. And as part of this excitement, there's been surveys asking these people why they do it. It's participating in science, they like that. Working with scientists, doing cool stuff with astronomy images. Okay, and other people say it's just damn addictive. So there's lots of reasons people do this. So let me just give you this little lesson here, and sort of why, where does the science come into this? Okay, so again, we're not just putting up a pretty game for people to play with. We're doing some scientific research, and so this all just ties back to our earlier talk this morning about how there's evolution across the time in the universe. Part of that evolution is the change in the structures of galaxies. So we see 2 general types of galaxies in the universe: spirals, spiral shape, and ellipticals, which are sort of these elliptical blobs. Okay, so here's a gallery of some ellipticals, sort of blobby, structureless. And Here's the gallery of some spiral galaxies, which has this spiral shape, which we think our Milky Way is one of these. Okay, so out there also in the mix of all these galaxies are these peculiar galaxies. And there's a long story about that, and I spend my career studying peculiar galaxies. And it's come down to the interpretation that these things are caused by the collision of galaxies. That collision causes this very peculiar morphology while the collision is taking place. But these galaxies, which may have started out by just being normal spirals, go through this massive upheaval just caused by the gravitational violent relaxation, which they end up looking like elliptical galaxies. So a big question when I was in grad school, which I won't say how many centuries ago that was, but why are there two types of galaxies, spirals and ellipticals? And I think people have come to the revelation that it has to do with the growth of structure in our universe. That as spirals come close together, they merge and create ellipticals. Okay, so mergers and collisions of galaxies are very common and actually tell us a lot about the dynamical evolution, the rate of evolution and change in our universe. So there are a few more of these things. These are Hubble images of some colliding merging galaxies. I love these things. I'm just going to throw a few pretty pictures at you. I can't avoid that, right? Okay, so there's the one equation in the talk, the fundamental equation of galaxy merging, 1 + 1 = 1. Okay, so two spirals merge to make an elliptical. Okay, so that's the end of the math of this talk. Okay. Anyway, so just some more pictures. Okay, again, yes, astronomers need to have the lights down to see these gorgeous things. So there was one of my 15 minutes of fame. Anyway, that was a cool one. One galaxy punched through another one, and just like a pebble in a pond, you get the ripple effect of this ring galaxy. So the universe is full of galaxies. We think these ellipticals that we see in here came from the merger of these disk galaxies, these spiral galaxies. And knowing the rate that that happens, and how much it, and where it happens, like what density regions of the universe, and so on, is a very important cosmological question. And so the best thing to answer those questions, as we heard this morning, is to beat down the cosmic variance, get as big samples as we can possibly get. And so what Arthur Smith was doing when he started, what he didn't realize at the time was the genesis of Galaxy Zoo. When he was sitting at his desk doing those classifications, he was classifying those galaxies from the Sloan Sky Survey, those million that have the redshifts measured, that is distances measured, spiral, elliptical, or merger. And getting really good statistics on that was really helpful. Well, okay, so we've collected images up to now of hundreds of millions of galaxies, and maybe only analyzed 10% of those. Okay, and so Galaxy Zoo is really helping us along the way here. But in the next 10 to 20 years, we will have images of tens of billions of new galaxies. Okay, so a survey which I'm involved with, which I didn't have time even to talk about here today, the Large Synoptic Sky Survey, the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, which hopefully will come up into existence by the end of the 20-teens, will have images of about 20 billion galaxies. Okay, so it's just a factor of 100 or 500 times more galaxies than we've ever imagined before, and we've only maybe analyzed 10% of those we have today. So how are we going to identify all these spirals, ellipticals, and mergers? Oh my. Okay. So something like citizen scientists can help. Okay, citizen science and the citizen scientists. So up to date, Galaxy Zoo citizen scientists have helped us to classify millions of galaxies. The bottom number, I'm not so sure. That's not updated recently, so it's probably more like 250 to 300 million classifications have been collected. And this number I just checked yesterday, 390,000 participants and growing. I should say Galaxy Zoo had its birth on a slow news day. Okay, so back in July of 2007 is when Oxford University released it and had a news announcement on BBC. And because pretty much nothing was happening big time in the world news that day, BBC ran with it, and I think within the first 24 hours there were 10,000 users, and the smoke was coming out of the server room, and they had to put new servers online by the end of the week. They had 40,000 users, and it's just grown crazy. So it's very simple. Click, what is that, elliptical, this galaxy, so colliding, peculiar galaxy, merger. So a funny thing happened on the way to classifying galaxies is one thing which you learn about human cognition, especially if you're not a scientist, in the sense that a scientist is focused on the galaxy. What is that galaxy? What is it? Is it a spiral, elliptical? I'm focused on that galaxy. But the person who's not trained as the scientist to look at the spiral arms and the bulge and the dust lanes and all these interesting things that an astronomer would ask themselves. The person who's not the astronomer says, well, gee, what's that blue thing next to it? Well, there was this third grade school teacher in Holland named Henny van Arkel who raised that question one day. So she was a Galaxy Zoo volunteer. She, as she described it, every morning before she went to school to teach her third graders, with her tea, she would classify a few galaxies, okay? And one day she saw this thing. She was asked to classify this galaxy, but she said, what's that? And the what's that turned into quite a firestorm of research, which is another great story. Paper has been published now about this green blob, which is a light echo from a quasar that died about 100,000 years ago. Okay, that's quite a story, which I can tell you over lunch. That's another long story. But it's pretty cool. So this is a true color picture of Hanny's Voorwerp, as it's now called. Now the Voorwerp, or she told me how to pronounce it, Voorwerp, there's like 4 or 5 syllables in there. The Dutch. It's a fancy word which means object. Okay. All right. So Hanny's object, or it's more cool to say Hanny's Voorwerp or Voorwerp, if you can say it in Dutch, which I can't. But anyway, so this is a true color picture of this ionized oxygen, which is a light echo of a quasar, which was in this galaxy 100,000 years ago, and it took 100,000 years for the light to travel, bounce off that, and then, of course, light coming to Earth takes much longer than that, but the sideways travel was a 100,000-year detour before the light headed to Earth. True color picture of Hanny's Voorwerp, and here's a true color picture of Hanny and me. Okay. So she's actually now studying astronomy. Okay, so this is one of the transitions that's happening with citizen science, is that a lot of these people are now going back to school, whether grad school or college, first time undergraduate, to study science. They find this really exciting. They want to participate in science. They want to do science. And so it's actually having quite a positive effect, which is why we see the education community really latching onto this, because it's a way of attracting people into science more so than your traditional textbook approaches. Okay, so out of all this grew the Zooniverse project. Okay, so this is a recently funded cyber-enabled discovery in the CESS program, which you can find out about us at zooniverse.org. The PI is Lucy Fortson, who used to be at Adler Planetarium, who's now at University of Minnesota, but actually now, today, she's actually at Columbia University, so she's down the street. She didn't sneak in there, my doctor.
She should be here.
Huh?
She should be here.
Yeah, well, I told her I was going to be doing this, but she had other meetings. Okay, so Lucy Fortson, John Wallen, myself, Chris Lintott, who was sort of the PI of Galaxy Zoo at Oxford. So it's building a framework so you can now have many, many different zoos. Okay, so it's easy to add your own science case. You add your own collection of data, whether it's millions of images of the moon from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, or millions of images of the sun from the Stereo mission, or whatever. People can now contribute by classifying, describing, characterizing what they see in the images. So astronomy, the sun, the moon, and even Egyptology, which I'll tell you a bit more about that. And now we're actually, so people are looking at old papyri images to collect, basically do human optical character recognition of the Greek symbols and translating essentially what's written on those documents. And a more recent one is old weather, so they're looking at ship logs from the World War I, from the British Navy. So actually a way of tracking climate change. Okay, so they kept very accurate records of weather as they traveled around the world. And so those records, now we can have a 100-year baseline of some change in temperature and climate and that kind of stuff from those records. And so these are written records. I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of these documents exist, but they've been scanned and put online. And again, if you asked your grad student to do it, they would probably do the first few hundred or few thousand, and they would croak and give up. But you put 500,000 documents online, and we have 400,000 volunteers ready and willing to look at what they see in the document, read it, and extract a temperature or a barometer reading or whatever it is you're asking them, what rainfall, whatever it is. We have people willing to do that. So as I said, the sun, we can have citizen science just look at tens of thousands, millions of images of the sun, looking for solar storms and CMEs. Me getting a drink of water. So looking at the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter data, which is this ridiculously huge data set of millions of images of the moon now at a much higher resolution than we've had over the full surface of the moon than before. And you say, okay, people are counting craters and measuring craters, and yes, that's what they're doing, but just like Hanny's forework, people were seeing other things in the images besides the craters that we're asking them to measure and count. People have found cave lights. Say what? What are cave lights? Okay, well you have like a sinkhole. There's a depression. There's a cave under the surface. It could be a volcanic vent. The surface collapses in, right? So now that cave is exposed. As the sunlight shines in from different angles from these reconnaissance orbiter images, you see the sunlight reflected inside the cave. So it actually looks different from image to image. And they say, how is that possible? Because you're actually looking into the depression. You're not seeing something on the surface, something below. And someone's actually found a freestanding arch. So we're used to those on the Earth, which are normally caused by erosion. So you say, what the hell? There's no wind or water on the moon, is there? No, this is probably a volcanic vent, which has been exposed by what they call in the moon weathering, which is the micrometeorites breaking down surface material. And so the volcanic vent has been exposed, and there's a freestanding arch. We didn't ask people to go find freestanding arches. Someone found it. Okay. Anyway, pretty cool stuff. So here's the papyri examples of fragments from the papyri project. So these were found in this site in Egypt, which was settled by the Greeks after Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 300 BC. And as I hear the story, this particular site got its water from a canal from the Nile River. So it wasn't near the Nile. It was a canal that gave them the water. So this particular site didn't suffer the normal rising and fallings of the Nile and the flooding, which wiped out a lot of historical documents and historical settlements from the early days. This site essentially has no rainfall and has basically ceased to exist, because once the Nile sort of dropped below a certain level, at some point the canal ceased to have water in it, and they just abandoned the site. So over a period of 1,000 years or so ago, starting about 2,500 years ago, they had landfills where they throw their junk, and those landfills are preserved to today. And one of the things they found in these landfills is basically the used shredded people came and took away all people's pieces of paper and threw them in one pile. So there's this pile of 800,000 fragments, which could be shopping lists or real estate documents or political documents or literature writings or poetry or love letters, I don't know what. So we're asking people to look at this and to say, what is that letter? What is that letter? What is that letter? What is that letter? Okay, so the optical characteristic recognition software can't do what a human can do. But not only can they look at that and say that's a tau or an omicron or whatever, they can say, oh, there's doodles in the margin. Okay, so again, the Hanny-Warburg phenomenon. There's extra stuff there that if you just had a computer optical character recognition software running this, you would miss this nice picture of Hercules. So this writing is about the labors of Hercules. And this one is a proof of one of Euclid's theorems, and there's a little sketch there helping with the proof. Okay, so that stuff would have been missed if you didn't have the human looking at it. So this is just a little bit of the examples. There's like 9 or 10 now of zoos within the Zooniverse project. So we have the Galaxy Zoo, which was our original classic. The Merger Zoo, I'm going to show you really quickly some slides from that right after this, where we're actually having non-scientists run in-body simulations for us. And so far we've had 20 million in-body simulations viewed by our citizens. Okay, I'll tell you about that in a second. And the hunt for supernovae, the Moon Zoo I mentioned, Milky Way project looking for bubbles and other features in the maps of the infrared maps of the Milky Way.
Wait, how many galaxies are there in the Galaxy Zoo project?
Galaxy Zoo has 1 million.
And so have all of them already been processed multiple times? Or?
Yes, we have over 200 classifications each.
Oh, for every single image?
Right.
Okay, so you've got good statistics on...
Yeah.
Okay.
So the punchline of this talk, which I'll just say now since you raised the question, is these tag data, these annotations that citizen scientists provide, create a new data flood. We now have hundreds of millions of these annotations. Can we now mine those data for interesting patterns? So the interesting patterns might be about the users themselves. As I said, there are people who are gaming the system. It's also some interesting information about the classification of galaxies. For example, if you have a particular galaxy and among those 200 classes, 99% of the people say this and 1% say that, you probably believe it's this. But if 50% say this and 50% say that, that's the one the scientist wants to go look at. Like, what's in that image that makes it so damn hard for a human being unable to classify? So looking at those statistics leads the scientists to some really interesting stuff. Okay, so doing data mining on those data is sort of the new challenge. So we had this huge multi-terabyte, soon multi-petabyte data set. We've now reduced it to just a few gigabytes, but still it's a lot of information to look at. Yeah.
Do users get information about their own ranking? I mean, is that something
No. Well, I think in the early days of Galaxy Zoo, people got a score of how many galaxies they classified, but they took that off because, again, we found there were people just clicking just to get up the scoreboard, and they weren't actually providing any scientific data.
Right, but
so we took that away because that wasn't
helping.
helping.
Have information about how good their fits are compared to the population. So
Yeah, I think
the
there was
rank
some
should
sort
go
of
down.
weighting. I think there was some sort of weighting to it.
To what? I'm sorry.
How correct they were.
Oh yeah, that's what I was saying earlier, that if we look at a particular person's classifications, and if they're always an outlier compared to the rest of the distribution,
Yeah, but I think
then
they were
we can
told
determine
that-
that person's weight has to
But they
be
don't tell them.
reduced.
They don't tell them.
No, we don't tell them. We don't tell those people that. No. Yes.
Apropos of that, there actually is a big emphasis now in machine learning research on interpreting the results of human computation, either from Mechanical Turk or other sorts of crowdsourced data sets. You know, how do you weight users, how do you compare users, etc. But I was actually wondering, since you're on the forefront of using this data, how bad is it? How bad? I mean, if you just show the same image to a bunch of users, is that enough to handle the noise and reduce variance? Like, or do we really need to be studying all these machine
I
learning
think
algorithms?
it's, I think it's actually the combination of all of those, as it turns out. Right. So fortunately, I mean, we've been very fortunate that there's a lot of very altruistic people participating in Galaxy Zoo, and not a lot of people trying to game it. They really try hard to do it right. Okay, so we're really already getting some really good data, but as you know from crowdsourcing, I mean, there's all kinds of crazy things. But for example, when people rate hotels or rate travel sites or whatever, I mean, so people leave their comments and they rate it. Okay, so that's crowdsourced information, and we know that some of that stuff is probably, you know, gamed in one direction or another. Right? It might be your competition trying to lower your ratings or something. Yeah, so there's a lot of research going on in the machine learning community, even in the psychology community about this. So, yeah, Charles.
To that point, galaxy classification is highly subjective anyway. So when you have the wisdom of crowds coming in this instance, it actually can improve what normally is done just by a few pairs of trained eyes. So choosing the question to solve in this technique is an important delimiter in the effectiveness of what you choose.
Very good point. Thank you. Right. So anyway, so I talked about this merging of galaxies, building blocks in the fundamental equation. I showed the same equation twice, but it's only the same equation. Okay.
The sign's wrong.
Huh?
The sign's wrong.
Whoops. So in Galaxy Merger Zoo, we present from the Sloan Image Archive a pair of galaxies. And typically they're galaxies that have some kind of distortion. That is, they don't look like undisturbed, nice, grand designed spirals or ellipticals, but they have some kind of tidal distortion, which we believe is caused by the gravitational interaction. So we present that to the users, and for example, in a grayscale image, and they get to run. I'm not showing you the interface here. The interface is also very addictive. It's like slot machines. You have the Sloan image in the middle. They push a button, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 simulations. You actually watch the simulation run in real time. Not real time. I shouldn't say that. Real time for the computer, not the universe. Real time for the universe is 2 billion years. But they watch the galaxies zoom together, and so they get to click on the ones they like, and go to the next one. Click on the ones they like, move to the next one. Okay. So you watch the little spinning wheels and click. Watch the little spinning wheels and click. Okay. So we've had I don't even know what the number is, over 10 million simulations viewed, and out of that, people have selected some really good models. And part of this is that this is what I did for my thesis, PhD thesis. I modeled 2 pairs of colliding galaxies. I spent 3 years looking at about 300 or 400 simulations. Okay, in the first week alone, we had 20,000 simulations viewed by our volunteers. In the first year, we had like 2 million simulations viewed by our volunteers. Okay, so we're able to actually get good working models searching through an 18-dimensional parameter space of collision parameters and galaxy shape and orientation parameters. And I just want to show you a few of these, not with any explanation, but just to show you a few examples. So in every one of the next few slides, you'll see the color image just reproduced in grayscale here, and then 3 of the best matching models that volunteers found for us. And these people don't know gravitational physics. They don't know about any n-body simulations. They don't know anything about those 18 parameters unless they want to. We do have an expert interface as well, but most of them don't. All they're looking at is the pattern, the shape, and they click on the things where the patterns and shape look like, about the same. So here's one. Here's a very interesting one. So from a wide variety of different types of morphologies, people are finding as good starting points. And what I mean by starting point is these are simple, restricted 3-body problems, and one of our grad students is now using those as starting points for full n-body tree code with SPH, that is gas and stars in the model. So this is the start of basically a PhD thesis for an astronomy grad student using the inputs from the citizen scientists. All right, so here I am, back near the end. Okay, so the Zooniverse project consists of a lot of these different zoos, and as I said, we're collecting these tags, and these tags are producing this new data flood, as I had just mentioned. Okay, and so one of the things which is part of our project is not just to create a framework and create more websites, but actually to do data mining and to study this sort of what Claire was mentioning, the machine learning and data mining on this new data flood that is these volunteer contributed tags. So for example, how do these tags and labels correlate with scientists measured parameters? That is, things that we put into our data processing pipelines. What features that we measure in those images, how do they correlate with what people are actually seeing in the images? And the ultimate goal is to train and improve the automatic classifiers so that when we get to those big projects of the future where we have 20 billion galaxies, not just 1 million, we have better classification algorithms, better identification of anomalies, fewer classification errors, etc., all of which are based upon millions of training examples. And as I was also hinting at, there's other things we can do with these tag data. We can assess our users, how they're doing for us. We can do this sort of uncertainty quantification of the ability to match a given thing to what people think it is. Okay, how much uncertainty is there in that? For example, in our merger simulations, how much uncertainty is there in a best fit model? Okay, it's really hard to do in simulation space with an algorithm, but humans can look at that and say, yeah, that's a little bit in, that's a little bit out in terms of a match. We can look at, so the interesting question is this classification certainty versus the dispersion. Like I said, so if 99% say one thing, 1% say another, that's a very different case than 50-50. It's those 50-50 cases that become very interesting scientifically. So our first case study, I'm running out of time here, I'm not going to give you much detail on this, but we actually looked at parameters which are actually in the Sloan Digital Sky Survey database. I'm not going to read through these or explain them to you, but we did a couple of different tests to see which ones of those correlate most with the mergerness seen by human eye. Okay, so we had those million galaxies that the Galaxy Zoo volunteers looked at. They picked out like 3,000 of those which are mergers. So this is probably the largest clean sample of merging galaxy pairs that we now have in astronomy. It came from this citizen science project. And for those mergers, which parameters in the Sloan database could have told us that they were mergers? So we did some analysis there, and again, it's a story that I don't have time to tell you. But it turns out they were parameters that we probably could have guessed in hindsight would have been consistent with being mergers, that is distortions, gradients in the isophotal major axis and things like this. So there are things which in hindsight said, yeah, that probably should have been one we would have thought of, but it's great now that we have an objective determination of that. And so it's not just looking at these parameters one at a time, but even in combinations. And this actually, so we now have this possibility of doing sort of a combinatorial exploration of those parameter space. And this led me to another idea of a correlation zoo, okay, where we actually show plots to people, heaven forbid, graphs. and you ask people, do you see some pattern in the data? Okay, yeah, okay, you can imagine doing automatic things where you're maybe doing linear or nonlinear regression and curve fitting and things like that. But what if there's some kind of peculiar pattern in the data? Like, for example, let's say there was a spiral pattern in the data, okay, or lots of ups and downs, okay, so you certainly wouldn't be fit by any kind of linear regression. Anyway, so people can, the human eye can easily see patterns, anomalies, outliers, and so maybe a correlation zoo is the next thing. Okay, so again, one of the key areas of the Zooniverse project is the machine learning and the tags, but as a feature of that, we're going to have machine learning challenges. So this first one will be announced sometime later this year. It probably will be, there's probably impossible in the same sentence there because we haven't decided yet, but it'll probably be with the Digital Papyri project, which includes two components, which is the character recognition. Okay, so how can you improve the character recognition image segmentation algorithms for things like this, but also sequence mining. That is, how do you take a sequence of characters like that and actually determine what it is? Okay, is this a known text? Is this like an example of Homer's writings? Is it something new? What's the context? For example, is it a property sale, political document, love letter, whatever? So doing some kind of sequence mining on the patterned characters. And so we're not going to try to solve that problem, and I'm not saying these are the challenge tasks, but there will be challenge tasks associated with these annual machine learning challenges. We were going to do Moon Zoo this year, that's another story, but we're probably going to save that for next year. So we're asking people to help us to find improvements to the classification algorithms and the data mining algorithms for these things. So stay tuned for an announcement later this year. Thank you very much.
More questions for Kirk?
Lunch.
No? Yeah, go ahead.
I just downloaded the iPhone app for Zooniverse.
Yeah.
Do you have an Android one also?
You should ask me later.
Okay.
Okay, because I'm not involved with that part of the project to be able to answer your question. So,
I have a question.
yeah.
What happens with publications, say, thanks to these people discover something amazing and then you publish your papers?
Yeah.
You have to...
Well, there's two ways that we acknowledge people's participation. The first is, on the author list, we list specifically the people who contributed to that particular discovery. Okay, so if they actually contributed to the paper, they're on the author list. Otherwise, they just get an acknowledgement. But in every single paper, every one of the 390,000 volunteers are given credit. And you might say, how is this humanly possible? The way it's humanly possible, I'm sure you've seen these posters, okay, where from a distance it looks like a scene, like a building or a mountain, and you go up close and it's made up of all these little images. Right? Well, so all these people's names are in micro font printed on this poster, which is the shape of a beautiful spiral galaxy. So from a distance, so there's a link to the website from the paper where people can go look at this beautiful rendition of a spiral galaxy. But as you zoom in, every one of the 300,000 names are somewhere in micro font on that poster. So everybody gets their name somehow attached to the project, even though it's in 0.01115.
Yeah, I've got an idea for you. Would you take it to the opposite direction?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
I've got an idea for you on how you might take this in the opposite direction. The zoo projects are using it to answer questions that are interesting to us, the science. That's what we're doing. Well, we're going through a period of time when the public is very skeptical of science and the two results of science. The two examples that come to mind are the correlation with vaccines and autism, and the whole question of where climate change is heading. Well, why not have these zoo-type projects make available data to the public to assess for themselves what has gone on? YouTube, for example, what was changed with time, of course, there's large databases. We can have surveyed many children that have had vaccines. You can see what the results are. So people could learn for themselves the same conclusions that we come to. It's the old Feynman thing. The test has got to be explainable to a 6-year-old.
Right. Well, that's a very good suggestion, and I'm not quite sure how to make that into a new project because as I like to say to people is we're asking people to do characterization, not really classification. That is, and so I would say classification is an interpretation of what you're seeing. Okay? So people can say, yeah, I see a correlation in that data. Okay, and so if you can get several data sets of which there are, the examples you mentioned, and show them to people, and people can say, yeah, I'm seeing a strong correlation between that and this. Right? And so having people sort of search through these multivariate data sets and find that there's correlation between all these interesting scientific parameters in those problem domains you mentioned, I guess that would, in a sense, it would contribute to that public understanding of science. So what we're asking them again to do is to describe what they see, to characterize what they see, not to interpret, that is to put a class label. So we're not asking people to understand what merging galaxies are or what in-body simulations are or any of that stuff. They just say, yeah, that looks like that. And that has the same.
But here's the end of the
So the idea of a correlation to is people can look at data points in the scatter plot and say, yeah, there's correlation between this thing and that thing. Okay,
Yeah.
so if this thing and that thing happens to be a forcing and this happens to be a response to, say, the climate situation, then you say, wow, there's a correlation between forcing and response.
Yep.
That kind of stuff. So yeah, so that is possible. You have to frame the question in a way that you're not asking people to do data analysis, but you're asking them to do cognitive characterization of what they're seeing.
Oh, risk analysis. Would you put the farm on this result?
Yeah, so I think that, yeah, so crowdsourcing has all kinds of opportunities.